Conference. So I want to welcome you today as we continue in the Southeast Conference our discernment process about whether to become an open and affirming conference. We have been at this process, as I shared a minute ago with our panel. The conversation actually started about 4 years ago in the board of directors, but we wanted to have a very intentional process that was well thought out with a group of people who were engaged in it. So first of all, I want to thank, and some of them are on here, our Open and Affirming Discernment Process Task Force, who has been hard at work engaging in ways to invite the conference, the members, the churches, the ministry settings to participate in this conversation. They've been very committed to having an open table discussion and inviting all the voices to be at it, and trying to find all kinds of avenues to do so. So I'm really grateful for that. Our process actively began a couple of years ago. We started with putting out a survey that invited folks to just kind of tell us what they know and what their experience had been with Open and Affirming, whether they were in an ONA church or ever had been, if they'd been through an ONA process, if they knew what Open and Affirming was, just to give us kind of a baseline so that we could know how to offer opportunities for conversation that were at the different levels that folks needed them to be and provided the information they could. That survey shared with us that most people in the conference had a good sense of ONA, and a good portion of our churches, we know, I believe it's 23 of our congregations out of 57, and 3 of those are new church starts, so they're not registered yet, are open and affirming. But that several people in congregations had been in open and affirming churches. Some of our congregations function as open and affirming, even though they haven't been through the process. So there was a wide variety, but a lot of knowledge, and we were grateful for that. But we still wanted to make sure that everybody had a place to gather some information. Our annual meeting last year included a lot of opportunities, both to learn about open and affirming, but also to learn about communication skills and ways that we could engage together, because we really wanted our dialogue to be open and inclusive. And we've had some workshops. We had a couple of opportunities for folks to participate in what we call the clobber texts, the texts that are often utilized against people who are LGBTQIA from the Bible, to dive into the history and the understanding and the translation of them so folks could learn about those texts more fully and their actual context. We have a Gender 101 workshop coming up. We are having this panel discussion, and then we will be having some forums so that we have an opportunity for people to come in kind of a last gathering together. If we find that we need to continue to discern, we will do that. We're not setting a deadline on anything, but we do have the potential, if we are at that place, to invite folks to consider a resolution at our August annual meeting. That's not set in stone yet. We want to make sure everybody has a part in the conversation. So today I welcome you as we have this panel discussion with friends from the Indiana-Kentucky Conference of the United Church of Christ who have gone through this process recently. And the folks who are here are with us because they were active participants in leading the conference through the process. And so I'm grateful for them. I am also grateful for our Associate Conference Minister, Reverend Davey Fosberg, who is our technical guru and will be handling all things technical, and for Pamela Cook, who is a member of our committee of our task force for the ONA discernment, is a member in discernment here and will introduce herself more fully in just a moment. So let's get started with some introductions. Chad, if you want to get started.
Good morning, everyone. My name is the Reverend Dr. Chad Abbott. I'm the conference minister for the Indiana-Kentucky Conference. Just yesterday was the start of my 10th year. So we've done a lot of hard work, including this very particular movement and our conference. I'm really glad to be with you this morning.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dakota Faulkner. I serve as the Associate Pastor of Operations at St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Carmel, Indiana, which is on the north side of Indianapolis. And I have been involved with the conference in many different capacities, wearing lots of different hats over the years. But the one that I'm probably most proud of is chair of the Open and Affirming Task Force that led us to becoming an Open and Affirming conference.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. Izzy Harbin. I'm the pastor at First Congregational Church in Elkhart, Indiana. I'm also the project director for Beyond Imagination conference grant, so operate as a conference staff as well. And I was part of the task force. I was on the board at the time and was the liaison between the board and the task force and helped write the resolution. So it's exciting times.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Cook, and I have the honor of serving as your moderator this morning in our conversation. I come to this space as a member of the ONA Discernment Task Force for the Southeast Conference, and also as a member in discernment in the United Church of Christ, as a member of First Congregational UCC Atlanta. I am grounded in a womanist theology of love and an ethical perspective that asks a simple but powerful question: is this life giving? Especially for those who have historically been pushed to the margins. I also come shaped by the UCC's understanding that ministry and discernment are never solitary journeys, but are carried out in covenant with one another, with the church, and with the Spirit who is still speaking. So today we're not just having a discussion, we are participating in a shared act of discernment. As we begin, I want to ground us in a few shared understandings. This is a space for honest reflection, not persuasion, a space for listening deeply, even when we disagree, a space where we trust that the Spirit can speak through many voices. In the United Church of Christ, we hold that what unites us is often more important than what divides us, and that our tradition has always made room for freedom, diversity, and covenantal relationship. So I invite us to enter this time with openness, with curiosity, and with care. We are so grateful to be joined today by the members of the Indiana Kentucky Conference who introduced themselves and who have walked this journey and are willing to share their experiences. Thank you so much for being with us and for your willingness to speak honestly about both the challenges and the blessings of this process. I will guide our conversation with a series of questions, allowing time for each panelist to respond. Afterward, we'll open the floor for your questions. Let's share the screen so we can see our panelists. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the first question, more of an origin story. To begin, can you share what led the Indiana Kentucky Conference to embark on this journey of discernment about becoming open and affirming?
So I will start and invite my colleagues to jump in. The work of the Indiana Kentucky Conference becoming open and affirming stretches, I would venture to say, over a decade. Chad could correct me. He's been our conference minister for about that long. I was born and raised in this conference, and so I know that there was an initiative to begin that process a long time ago, and it was not taken to vote at the time. The discernment that it was required to do was made, and that was decided. The time was not then. But there were a coalescence of congregations that were open and affirming in the conference. And they recognized that they could do really good work together. They could learn from each other and not reinvent the wheel from one another. So they decided to start gathering in regions in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in Indianapolis, in Kentucky, to kind of just meet regularly and talk to each other. That work was led by the Reverend Dr. Sarah Lund and the Reverend Dr. Keith Phillips. And it was then in about 2018, 2019 that work was just getting really good legs under it. And then the pandemic hit. And it made it very difficult for us to gather together. And then in 2021, as we were coming out of the pandemic, Reverend Dr. Sarah Lund called me, and I was in my first call and said, I think this work has been really good and fruitful, and I think it's time that the conference really seriously consider becoming open and affirming. Would you be willing to spearhead something like that? After talking to Conference Minister Chad Abbott, I decided that was a calling for myself and for others. And so we formed the ONA Task Force with the blessing of the board of directors because we were in between annual meetings at the time. And so that's kind of how it got started, but there was a lot of discernment in the years prior to the formation of the task force that kind of led us there.
Yeah, go ahead, Izzy.
Well, I was just going to say, I think another thing that we really talked about is that we wanted to live into what we were already doing in the conference, right? At a conference level, we were already taking into consideration sexual orientation, gender expression, and everything that we did in voting on board members and synod, etc. And so we thought, yeah, this is like a no-brainer. Why haven't we done this before, right? And yeah, as Dakota mentioned, it's been talked about for a long time, and we finally said, yeah, we just really need to own who we are and accept the identity as well.
Yeah, and I think going back, Dakota, to what Dakota's referring to, there was definitely this coalescence of congregations in 2017, 18, and 19, where there was a lot of like, how can ONA congregations resource and support each other? And I will just say, I mean, I was ordained in this conference, but I was not born and raised like Dakota in the conference, but um the movement goes all the way back to like 2007, which we all know is like in the wake of the Atlanta General Synod of 2005, and we lost a lot of churches, and there was a lot of movement on both sides back then in '07, and it's almost like what we did in the late early 2000s was we put it on a shelf and said, oh, we'll talk about it at some point, we'll get a task force together so we can find a way through it, through all the conflict, which many of our conferences experienced after 2005. And it almost just then sat on a shelf. In fact, we did not have a resolution, period. It's almost like we did away with resolutions until 2020, right, Izzy? That was when we had a resolution that came in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was murdered within blocks of two of our churches. And so our churches were in the streets. We had a lot of, at that time then, movement around racial justice, but then, in many ways, because of the foundation Dakota described in 21 and 22, we began to see the deep need for us to move in the direction of discerning ONA. For me, I'll leave it with this: is I also met with Sarah Lund, but it was right after 2021 where we had, as a denomination, agreed to ban conversion therapy in one of our synods. And I said to her, as a Wise for Mental Health conference, how can we help support that implementation of that resolution? And her answer was, we need to become open and affirming. We have to stand first in that space before we can actually live out that resolution. And as Dakota said, from there, we began a 2.5 year process. So.
Thank you for that thorough answer. So it certainly was not a linear path, and we know that discernment is rarely easy. So talk to us about the hard part. What were some of the more difficult or challenging aspects of the process?
So one of the things that stuck out to me is that we had to do a lot of work around explaining the difference between the conference being open and affirming and an individual church being open and affirming, and that the conference decision to become open and affirming did not affect the local church. We heard rumblings, if you will, from some local church. Well, what does this mean for us? And how are we going to? Churches that didn't really want to even talk about open and affirming were very concerned. And we explained to them that we were already living an open and affirming lifestyle, if you will, at the conference level. And so they did not need to worry. It didn't automatically mean if we voted on this and it passed that would make your church open and affirming. That's a decision that the church had to make. So that initially that was one of the hard parts, that really getting good information to our individual churches and helping them understand the difference between conference level decisions versus church level decisions.
Yeah, I think piggybacking on what Izzy talked about, I think we spent a lot of time having to define what O&A wasn't rather than what it was, which is a similar vein. What you're seeing in evangelical versus progressive denominations is we're not those types of Christians. But then we leave a vacuum, which is to describe what kind of Christians are we. If we're constantly saying this is not what this is, that's not O&A, that's not O&A, that's not what it means, we really struggle for a definition of what it is and what it means. And because the conference was acting or behaving or operating in such an O&A way already, it was hard for people to tell what a difference would be. How will we look different once we become O&A versus what we are now? What kind of programs should we expect that we don't currently have? And because we were just working on the process of becoming O&A, we had none of that tangible product to give them. We had no way to say this is how you will know. You will know you are Christians by your love. Like, it's so difficult for us to define. That was really difficult for us to do. The other thing that I think was tricky was making sure everyone felt heard. Especially straight people of privilege, it was very difficult to make sure that those people felt like they had a space to be present and engaged. And as a queer person leading this initiative, it was difficult to sit and hear a lot of microaggressions as you're talking to folks who are on a learning curve, who are on a journey of faith, and really processing it live and out loud with you. So, you have to be a pretty well differentiated person when you're going into those spaces to say these people are not attacking me, they're not trying to hurt me, they are working through some things in my presence, and that might be difficult for me, but it's not personal.
I would say the hardest and most difficult thing were the conversations with folks who were really trying to wrap their head around the polity in the middle of all of this. What is what, as Izzy kind of indicated, what is it that the conference becoming open and affirming means for the local church? And a lot of times the local church already, those that are more conservative in our context, which I would say is a good portion of our churches, already struggle with how they identify themselves as using the word United Church of Christ, and are connected to the wider church, which is way more progressive and open and affirming than many of our small town and rural churches. But now our conference is saying that, is that going to mean that we who identify as United Church of Christ, does that lump us into the same thing? Do those really reflect our values? And I think that as the conference minister, our conference staff fielded lots of conversations when we visit churches, or letters or phone calls, emails asking about it and what does this mean. So I think some of the struggle was that. I also think that if I were to go, I haven't really talked to Dakota about this, but I think if I were to go back and do anything differently, I mean, I think we did a really good process. Dakota, Izzy, and the team did an amazing job. Our board really reflected deeply, in my opinion. If I were to go back and do anything differently, I probably would have disseminated, because we went to every association and had association conversations, so that church, so like Dakota said, so that churches could have a space to be able to ask questions or discern and listen. And we have 7 associations across both states, and If I were to go back and do anything differently, I would say that we probably needed to have more than just Dakota. And Dakota wasn't really the only one that was navigating those conversations, but I would say a large percentage. Dakota was in some spaces the only person navigating hard conversations with those associations, and we really needed to have straight allies on the team accompanying Dakota, because those, as Dakota said, those are really, the microaggressions were difficult for him, and difficult for any of our queer folks that might attend those meetings. So if I were to go back, that's probably one space I would do it, because some of those hard conversations probably should have been with those of us that are straight allies. But yeah.
Thank you for that. That's great advice for us, and we really appreciate that. In terms of surprises along the way, what surprised you, either about the process, the people, or yourselves?
One of the things I think that surprised me the most, and would probably shock a conference like you all perhaps, is rural churches are not the enemy of open and affirming. That there is a notion in the United Church of Christ that small and rural town churches don't want to be O&A, or that they aren't O&A, or that they're conservative and uneducated. That none of those things are true. There are correlations. There are not causations. There is a correlation that many rural churches struggle with being open and affirming. Doesn't mean that that's true of all of them. And in fact, I would find that in rural communities, community is what's necessary, and being O&A is being part of a community. And so there's actually a lot of translation, or a lot of work that overlaps there. The other surprise that I think I found was that there was such an audacity of people who felt like they weren't welcome to come talk about this, even though we held, as Chad said, 7 in-person and online opportunities for each association to participate, and more than that. Still, when we came time to vote, the biggest thing we heard at the debate was, "Well, you didn't invite me, or you didn't reach out to me, or you didn't call me and get my voice." It was just a little bit of audacity, I would say, because we had all these opportunities, but that's just, you're always going to encounter that. So it was a surprise, but also expected.
Yeah, I would. There was a little bit of that too, Dakota. And I think one of the things that I look back at with our annual meeting in particular, um, there were only really 2 people that stood up and were in the no category, and they were of the audacious standpoint. But what was so heartening to me was the microphone speaking in favor had a really long line, and the amount of times I was just waiting for my phone to ring or my email inbox to have the letter or a written letter from a congregation. And I think knowing the history of our conference has really struggled with this issue over the years. I kind of expected that we would get significant amounts of pushback. And quite frankly, we did not. It doesn't mean that there weren't in Dakota's groups that we met with in association, there weren't pushbacks or struggles in that way. But I think we did such a, like in the 2.5 years that we did this, the task force and the board really did such a good job at engaging it that I felt like people had really gotten a sense of where they stood on it, and there was really there wasn't a lot of vitriol or negativity or any of that. It almost like we showed up, and the biggest thing for me was we have a certain, the coalition obviously has like a percentile. I believe it's 90% should be the vote for certification to become ONA, and our vote came back. I think there were only 6 no votes, and so it was 94%. And it said to me that we had the support of the conference. We didn't have to sit there and worry, did we have 50, 60% of people, yay or nay. I mean, we had a very clear sense. We did surveys as well, like Kim, like you all have done. We did in-person stuff. We did online stuff. We had feedback from the board. We had more moderate to conservative folks on our board who spoke, but it was so clear to me we had the support of the conference, and we didn't have to worry about that. That was really a nice surprise.
And I will follow up on that too, Chad, is that there are a lot of ways that people express themselves. Some folks feel comfortable by speaking, some by writing. But one of the things I think you might find is a lot of people make their opinions known by whether or not they show up. Our annual meetings, I would think yours do this too, trend toward more progressive minded people. The people who are willing to spend a weekend at your annual meeting are usually more progressive, or at least been involved with the church long enough that they're kind of on board with church movement and change. And so the people, your population of voters that are showing up trend towards being supportive. That's not exclusively the case or causation the case, but so that was another thing. Like while there were some outspoken folks at annual meeting that were, sort of struggling with it, the folks who probably struggled the most or were the most against it weren't in the room. They were back at their church. They were at home. Still in the conference, still part of our work, absolutely, but they didn't feel the need to be there in participation or in opposition.
That's an interesting point, and definitely something I think we should take into consideration in terms of um, who's in the room, and whether there are ways we can make it even more undeniable that we opened up the discussion to everyone. I'm not sure what that would look like, but yeah, I am thinking about that. I also appreciate the comment about small and rural churches, because I've been a part of a rural UCC church, and it totally destroyed my stereotype. So it's what helped me lead with curiosity in situations. So let's move on to the impact of this process on the conference. Did it have an impact? And do you think that impact would have been meaningful regardless of the final outcome?
Don't know if this is actual impact, but sort of a response to was kind of mixed for me. We heard from one of our sister conferences, oh, we've been O&A for X amount of time. Why is it taking you so long? So we had that kind of response. And then on the other side, we had uh, some churches saying, "Well, I just don't know about this. I don't know why we're doing this. Why do we have to do this now?" And so there was this effort, I think, to walk sort of this middle ground and try to find a balance for who we were in this moment. And I think when we finally did vote, and to hear the eruption in the sanctuary and the cheers and how happy people were, that told me everything that I needed to know about who we were and what we were all about, and what was important to the people that show up consistently over time to do the work, right? And um, I think since then the task force has done some amazing things at providing resources and connection for churches and helping other churches become O&A, and they're continuing to discern, like, how do we move forward? What can we bring still to this conversation? And so yeah, it was kind of an interesting moment in the beginning to be caught between those two perspectives.
Yeah, I think in terms of impact, Pamela, there's a couple things I would say. I think it's hard to tell just yet. Let me just say that. We just voted 2 years ago, and as Izzy said, we kind of have been, we had written policy around our nominations process years before we actually voted. That included how we nominate people to the board, to general synod delegates, that kind of stuff. We have queer people on our staff, so like we've been kind of living in this. So in that way, we don't see a lot. I haven't seen like a lot of like here's been the huge splash of impact. The one place I will just say that really made a huge impact on me in particular. One of the challenges so in Indiana, it's true of Kentucky too. I'm not sure of your states in the South, but um, in Indiana in 2023 in particular, which was a year before we voted ourselves as the conference, um, there was some pretty significant anti-trans legislation, and it was some of it was horrific, to be frank. And I am so grateful. My associate pastor Dakota Faulkner here was one of the people who went down to the state house and spoke out and was very, very, very courageous and had very eloquent things to say. Did they listen to him? Not much, but man, it was so great to see his voice. But here's the thing, right? Is I had folks who would say to me, well, where is the voice of the conference, right? Where is the conference? And I had to say, well, that's a hard thing, right? Because we are a Just Peace conference. We voted on that decades ago. We are a Wise for Mental Health conference. We voted to become Wise in 2019. But we are not open and affirming. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have an opinion as the conference minister, but the we had a lack of clarity, I think, about what the role of conference staff, particularly my role, having the ability to speak on behalf of the Indiana Kentucky Conference in spaces like the Indiana State House or the Kentucky State House. It felt to me and my board, we had a long drawn out conversation about it. Izzy remembers it. They were on the executive committee where we had that conversation. It was very clear that, when the conference itself has not spoken to an issue, it puts our staff in a very difficult bind because we might have opinions, very strong ones. You certainly do. But to actually speak to something that we ourselves have said, this is a value, this is a justice cause that we ourselves have spoken to and care about and empower our staff to engage. At the time, we had not done that. And so one of the big impacts for me was we voted in 2024, and it was in 2025. That was when was it? August of 24. By January of 2025, we had they have an LGBTQ day at the State House, and because of so much that was going on politically across the U.S., there were, I don't know how many people were there at the State House for that particular event, but I did a little call out to all of our O&A congregations and said, would you join me at the State House? And many of them came, and it was really heartening to me. And so in terms of impact, it gave me personally as the conference minister, when there's a moment to speak, I now have the the discerning empowerment to know when to do that, whereas before it was so super confusing. We continue to see anti-trans legislation. I've spoken with lots of our legislators about. So I mean, in terms of impact, Pamela, it really does matter that we've given voice to ourselves as a conference in that way.
Well, and I will say too, to Chad's point, the two most impactful parts of our covenant thus far, because as Chad named, it's now an ongoing process, right? It's always a challenge to live into being O&A. The work doesn't stop when you pass a resolution; it begins. And one thing, if we haven't shared our resolution with you all or in our covenant, we will be sure to do that in some form or fashion. But it was very important to us that we named that our conference minister would be the moral voice of our conference. If your conference minister is not allowed to speak and speak for a conference, then there are some issues there, because that is what they should be, is the moral and ethical voice of your conference. And so we wanted to, take the chains off of Chad to be able to do that. Chad is also the parent of a queer child, and it is very difficult to live as a parent of a queer child and not be able to speak out in support of your child's rights and your child's life. And so that's a huge impact for us, I think. And what I always said at every association meeting I went to is, I said, if this resolution does nothing, no program, no funding, no anything, if it does nothing more than save a child's life who's considering suicide because they're not welcome in their church, it will have been worth all of the years, all of the resources, all of the fighting. If it saved just one kid's life, if it was Chad's child's life or any child's life, if it was just one, not 20 or 40, but one, it was worth all of it. So in terms of impact, I don't know that anyone has come to us and said that covenant saved my life, but maybe it will quietly somewhere. So.
Well, thank you for that. And on that note, I want to say never doubt the impact of even the smallest gesture. And I'll share something that I was a member of Trinity UCC in Chicago. And when I joined it, and one of the reasons I joined it is because in front of the church, it had a sign, Free South Africa. One of the most impactful justice moments I've experienced is seeing former prisoners in South Africa on Robben Island coming to our church and telling how they heard about this sign and it encouraged them. And so I agree with you. I think it's powerful, even if it's just one. We save one child. We uplift that one person who can drown out the other voices with the voice of love from a conference. So earlier, Chad mentioned that in hindsight, one thing you would do differently is with the open conversations that you all had with different associations, that it not be led by a queer person alone, that a straight ally at the very least needs to be involved. And I think about racial justice work, the way we try not to have a person of color always leading the conversations. We balance it out. And so I certainly hear that suggestion. Are there any other things you would do differently in hindsight?
I think tactically something I think we could have done differently, and you all are further along in the process than when we first started. And you're doing you're checking all the boxes, the right things as far as the process goes. One of the things I think that would have been helpful for us, I think, would have been to try to get some funding for the process for marketing. To do some sort of advertising of the conversations that we were having. That I kind of call it my association whistle stop tour. Chad and Monica, our conference staff, are doing a covenant tour where they're trying to visit a different church every Sunday. So I went to every association physically, and others did too. But I remember driving up to the Northwest Association meeting, and it was me and my husband. And we went up there, and it was just the pastor of the church that was hosting it and their building and grounds team leader. No one else showed up. It was just the host. No one came. And was it because we only advertised on Facebook and in the conference newsletter via email every week? I don't know. Or if it was just a busy weekend in Northwest Indiana and I didn't know about it. My husband and I ended up buying a dresser from someone on Facebook Marketplace to make the trip worth our while. But it it's not about successes in the numbers. That's not what I'm saying. We had a very lovely conversation, the four of us. But yeah, I think in hindsight, the tactical of try to get some money if you can. I know money is thin around here with things as much as they cost, but if there's grant money or some conference discretionary funds to like boost Facebook posts or to do some sort of mailing to each congregation or something, anything like that that is just something different than your normal communication channels, I would say that.
That is quite helpful. And we
Yeah,
know
I
how.
think.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Pam. Yeah, I was just the only thing other thing I would say is I think that at the time the ONA coalition for the denomination was going through some times of transition. Um, I really do wish that maybe we had had a little bit more interaction and connection with them. I think they could have, offered some insight and guided. They did. I mean, they did when it came to voting and other things. I sought out some of their wisdom and guidance, but again, they were kind of in transition, and we were, moving towards our vote, but I think their presence at a distance is important as we think about our connection to the wider United Church of Christ. It feels to me like that was one thing that felt pretty absent. I think I think Dakota and the team that he led and our board worked really well together, and um, I, I'm really proud of the work that they did. I think that it felt a little bit too distant from the coalition for me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for both of those insights in terms of the process. Um, the next question has to do with kind of life after the decision, and we touched on this a bit. And so, if you don't have anything additional, that's fine. But um, how has the decision shaped your life together since then, since becoming open and affirming?
So here's the thing I would just name for me that's been maybe the most challenging thing post, and maybe this you've experienced if you're in a local church, maybe you've experienced this a little bit with your own leadership. Is there was a lot of energy, and Dakota described it. It went all the way back to 18 and 19 when we were doing, gatherings among ONA churches. There was energy, a lot of energy. The time that our ONA churches began to coalesce in the time of the 2 year frame that we were discerning, there was a ton of energy. And I think one of the things that happened with our annual meeting is Dakota's right. It's not a now a checked box, and oh, we got that done. Thank God we're now open and affirming. Whew, we can take a breath and then move on. Nope, this is the beginning of a journey, right? And it does feel to me like one dynamic that, and maybe this is a little of how might have done things a little differently. I guess I don't know, but we got across the finish line. But like any marathon you're running, it's exhausting, right? And you get to the other side and your leaders are tired. And then it's like, okay, we've gotten to there. We did what we historically have been dreaming of doing for a long time, but now we need people to lead it. And right. And it shouldn't just fall on the people that were part of the original task force to then help the whole of the conference live into this new covenant. And then neither should it fall only on the staff or only on the board. It should be a system-wide thing, but who's going to kind of lead that, if you will? So like the after the vote thing for me is I do wish that the board had thought, I wish we had kind of navigated together better, like how we might have strategized leadership, so that we could give some folks a break. Not that that's like they walk away from the works, but just more like in terms of like the logistics of leading a team or leading programming in the conference. Um, we've we've got a team that's there, but I think I would say we struggled to like make sure that that team is fully filled out and with programming and ideas and having that team work coalescing together. I think they're a great team. They've done good work. We like you all. We did a program recently with Leah Roberts Moser from the Illinois Conference on the Clobber passages, a webinar called Biblical Self Defense, where she addresses those things. And it was really well attended. And it was a great experience. And I mean, we had 50 some people on Zoom. It was lovely. But like, if I were to describe an area where where we're after the vote is, I wish there was a way to continue to empower leaders rather than exhausting them and then trying to struggle to find new leaders.
Yeah, so after I led the team for 2 years, I mean, I made it very clear that I would not be the person to be leading the team after. I think that's very. I would strongly encourage the current team to be discerning what their future with connection to O&A looks like. If they still have energy for the fight or for the work, then by all means. If they don't, respect that. Let them take that breath, that marathon rest. But I think the thing that the impact that is most like what comes next is what role does the conference have? Like, are you making a standing committee like we did? Are you giving it funding from your conference annual budget? Um, those sorts of tactical or practical items help rather than just a team of people sitting around talking. Not that that isn't impactful. We've had queer clergy circles that have coalesced around each other, communities of practice. So we've made space for specifically queer clergy. I think also like being able to tell clergy that we have a clergy shortage, obviously. And so clergy that are searching for churches now might consider the conference now that we're O&A, not because every church in our conference is open and affirming, but they know they have resources at the conference level if they were to take a non-O&A church as their calling. Um, and the thing for me that I still would like to see is like the conference has so much to do, right? It has a ton of work to do. It's not isolated to one set of programs. But like right now in Indianapolis, we have probably 4 or 5 UCC congregations that are either O&A or behave as their O&A. And my church has been leading going to the Indianapolis Pride Parade. And we partner with other congregations that want to do it. I would love to hand that over to the conference and say, you all are based in Indianapolis. You all coordinate these 5 people, these 5 churches, and more. And let's walk with a big United Church of Christ of Indiana, Kentucky conference banner. But there's a lot on our conference staff's plate, right? They're working a ton of hours to do. But those are kind of some things that could be done. But again, I don't have the energy to work on because I have other things too. So it's just difficult to kind of name who's going to be there to do that.
I was just pausing to make sure no one else wanted to speak, and that's not pressure. Um, so I think along the way you have talked about some ways in which you answered the question, what does it mean for the conference to be O&A? And I think that's really helpful for us, since you said that was one of the big questions that individuals who are attending forums ask. I'm wondering, are there any concerns that still remain with you after going through this process?
I think for me, the concern going forward is not necessarily with just our conference. It's with
Mhm.
O&A as a whole. O&A had a huge purpose in 1970. It was let's make sure queer or really gay men are welcome in the church. That was its initial fight. And they won that fight in the sense that someone was ordained as a gay male minister in the United Church of Christ. If you want to call that, the first win, it succeeded, right? And then it expanded so much into um, the full spectrum of queer identity. But now I think a lot of people are asking, what is ONA's purpose in the denomination as a whole? What does it mean to be ONA? Does it mean something different than it meant in 1985 or 2005 or now? And again, trying to articulate that we're not that, but we are this. And because so many ONA covenants did such a good job of going beyond gender and beyond sexual orientation, that now it includes the list, as it were, of everyone's welcome, including people who are divorced and people who are formerly incarcerated and people of all ages and races. And yes, absolutely, amen. And is it a queer movement or an everybody movement, right? Is it for queer people by queer people? Is it? I'm not answering all the questions, and I'm not saying that there's a right answer. I think it's just struggling with an identity crisis at the moment. Um, and then on the flip side of that, you have some folks who are in an ultra progressive camp in the United Church of Christ of should ONA be non-negotiable, right? Our polity struggles with this, but when we say UCC, should that mean ONA, right? What does it mean to be a UCC church and not be ONA when your denomination is, and maybe your conference is, but only 30% of your churches are? Again, I'm not implying that it should be, but the circles I work in, people say, should it be non-negotiable? Should we be revoking 501c3s for churches who aren't ONA, right? That's a huge, drastic step that I'm not suggesting they take, but I think my concern just lives with what is that coalition's future and the place in our denomination, and so that it doesn't become what we have lovingly called the Girl Scout badge of the UCC, which is I'm A2A, check, I'm ONA, check, I'm just peace, check, I'm wise, check, right? Like it those are important movements that require intimate discernment, as you all are doing and we did as well. But yeah, it's difficult.
To piggyback on what Dakota was just saying, there's also that branch in the United Church of Christ of faithful and welcoming, which is something that we didn't really address in our own process much at all. Uh, and uh, there's a space for that, I think, even within our own conference, especially with some of our more conservative churches, that's something that they could probably get on board with, uh, rather than going all the way and saying, we're ONA. Um, so part of the process, if I could have gone back and maybe changed some of our process, I would have introduced that concept as well to give people an option. Uh, but but in some ways it felt like that would muddy the waters. And so it's not it's not just a straight linear kind of thing, right? And I think I wanted that straight linear process. You start here, you go through the steps, and you end here, and all is well. And we found that there were a lot of jagged edges and some hard conversations that needed to be had. Um, and I think that probably the other part of this process that was concerning for me is that we did have some of our congregations who just absolutely refused to participate in any way in the process. Um, and I don't know, it made us rethink even the word covenant with one another and how we talked about covenant with one another. And so, um, and I don't have a solution either on how to get those individual congregations to come to the table and to know that they're welcome, and that whatever they feel in the moment is okay for where they are, but to just be a part of the overall process. So, yeah, I would have liked to have seen, some of those things.
Well, my colleagues have really named some of the major things here. I don't know if there's a lot much more to add, but this is what I would add is I think one of the things, I don't know if this is just a Midwestern nice thing, but I'm from the Midwest, so I know what that's like. But after '05, we lost a lot of churches, and I imagine that you did too. And I don't know what your numbers were. I think though we were afraid of this conversation for many, many years. And we were afraid, conference staff were afraid, board members were afraid, oh, we'll lose churches. It's a similar way, like if you do that in a local church, oh, we'll lose members if we become ONA, they're a big donating family. What if we lose them? That kind of language. And I think, I don't really have, uh, we've not really experienced in our process in the 2 years that we did it a whole lot of resistance to the work that we did. But Izzy's pointing to things that are accurate. We have churches that refuse to be engaged, and as Dakota said earlier, refused to show up at the annual meeting. Whereas in '07, that was definitely not the case. They were there loudly sharing their voices. We are now, almost 2 decades later, and my only concern is, can we have a amicable conversation now? We voted to become open and affirming. Will the churches just leave, or will they remain silent and be Midwestern nice and say, y'all did whatever you're going to do, we're not going to talk to you? Or will they just leave? And I don't spend a lot of time as the conference minister just fretting over people leaving, but as someone who is used the word covenant, as someone who believes so deeply in the covenant of the United Church of Christ, I am here and ready and willing to have those hard conversations. But people have to be willing, and I think my only concern is, are our churches going to be willing to invite me to the table to have a conversation that might be really hard? Sometimes I think we're just still, most of our Midwestern churches, we struggle with having the hard conversations. We much rather avoid them than actually have them. And I think there's some transformation that can happen if we have them. And I and our board and our Open and Affirming Task Force, we're willing to have them, but people have to be willing at the table. Will they be at the table? That's the question.
Yeah. And I think too, the last thing I'll say in terms of concern is we're living in an unprecedented time politically. Had this conversation been 2014 through 2016, we'd be having a whole different conversation. Chad's entire time, as he named, has been here for 10 years. Chad has not been conference minister outside of the Donald Trump era of politics, right? His entire conference ministry has been involved with that as a backdrop. It's incredibly difficult to lead not only a church, but a conference with that as the polarizing thing that is in the brains of everybody that's worshiping and participating. So, this issue, unfortunately, the issue of being ONA or not being ONA has become as equally polarizing as a lot of things in our society. And so to get people to want to sit down at a table and talk about that, people are looking for an escape from polarizing. They're not usually looking to jump into more polarizing. So the incentive for that is the question. That's the concern. What is going to incentivize them for that?
My take on these parallels, what's happening in the church and what's happening in society, is a wonderful opening for spirit. If we can lead the way with in our society, within our democracy, by demonstrating to the community that we can have these hard conversations, and especially realizing that transformation can certainly happen when we do sit at the table together. And so, the question is, how do we do that? How do we make how do we extend that extravagant welcome, that radical hospitality that we pride ourselves in as a denomination, um, into this context where it is um, uncomfortable? How do we invite people into the discomfort and see the good that's on the other side of that discomfort? Um, thank you for naming that. So the last prepared question is, what have been the sources of joy for you? You're on the other side. You're now ONA conference. What has brought you joy?
So I'm going to jump in. This is probably one of the most important questions for me. As I shared with a couple of folks before we started, I'm from Valdosta, Georgia, and so those of you from the South, you kind of know where that is. I was raised in a very Southern Baptist fundamentalist situation, which is fairly common in the South, and I was told my whole entire life that I was wrong, that I was invalid, that I was dysfunctional, I was willfully sinning, like just you can find the label. And I remember the first time I ever walked into a queer bar and immediately felt accepted and as if I had found my family, right? But bars aren't really the places that I wanted to be in order to find acceptance. And so when I found the United Church of Christ, it was like a, I don't know, like a breath of fresh air, because here's this denomination that's saying out loud, like, you are welcome, no matter who you are, like, come, please. So when we took the vote at annual gathering and it was affirmed by all of these people in the room, and there was this eruption of joy that we had become an open and affirming conference, I started crying because for the first time in my life, I actually felt
Mm,
completely and totally embraced by the church.
mm,
And you don't,
mm,
like, that didn't come easily to me. I had to really like be as vulnerable as I possibly could to receive that,
mm,
because I don't trust it, right? Having grown up in a system that tells you all the time that you're wrong. And so um people were hugging, other people were crying, and there was just this moment of like so much falling away from years past and being able to embrace something entirely new. And I'm fortunate to pastor a congregation that is open and affirming. We were open and affirming before the conference became open and affirming, and I am blessed with some amazing people in my congregation who love me exactly the way I am, and it's just incredible. But your congregation, like that's just a little tiny fraction of what I see as the whole church. And so for the IKC to become open and affirming, man, it felt like the whole church. It felt like everybody coming together and saying, you belong here. In fact, I'm tearing up here, like remembering what it felt like. And I think on the other side of this, like the joy that I see now is that we see people in individual congregations being able to stand up and proudly own their identity and not be afraid anymore because they know that the conference has their back and they're able to speak their truth in a way that they couldn't before. And that gives me such hope. I mean, like I've never felt before. And so like this issue was really important to me on so many levels. And to be a part of a conference, to work for a conference that is open and affirming, uh, it brings me joy every day.
thank you so much for that testimony, for that witness. That encouragement that what we do really does matter and has an impact on people we know, people we're in community with, people we care about.
I think the
So
joy
yeah,
for think the joy for me is I seeing the courage of congregations live into their identity as open and affirming churches, sometimes in very difficult spaces, is such a gift. Um, to see congregations that have wrestled for years with this particular issue to come to resolution and finding their voice. And I think in many ways for me, the joy of this is that we found our voice as a conference in this process. One that Izzy just described so beautifully. I can't say it, could not even come close to saying it any better than that. But I think I've seen a lot of our young people in particular, people who have been General Synod delegates and people who have answered calls to ministry, people who never could have even imagined that they would end up a United Church of Christ clergy, and here they are. We have one person in particular who's serving in different ways, 3 different congregations, and their journey to not only finding a church um, that welcomed them exactly as they are, but then said, "You are called to ministry." And then to see them thrive is a joy. We had an annual meeting in 2023 when we were just beginning this process, in the middle of this process, with a layperson who came up to me during the meeting and said, "I'm grateful that we're going through this process because I found my congregation, and I went to church, and I had heard that they were welcoming, and I went, and I'm not sure, like Izzy, had grown up in an experience that was not affirming at all, always told him he was wrong to be a gay man." And he went and sat in the congregation. He's like, I'm gonna go and see what it's all about. And on that first day, heard the words from the pulpit at the very beginning of the service. "We are an open and affirming congregation that affirms the life and worth and dignity of all human beings as holy and sacred in the eyes of God." Um, and from the pulpit during the sermon, being told they were worthy of God's love. And he basically said that changed my life. It changed my faith. It gave me faith in the church, gave me faith in Christ again. Those stories for me, that's the joy of this, and that we are proclaiming that, have the voice to proclaim that as a body of faith, as a father of someone whose life depends on it. Um, Man, it feels good to be a part of that community, as he so well described.
Yeah, I think the joy for me, I grew up in a much different context than Izzy named. I've been part of the United Church of Christ for my entire life. And even though I have been a member of churches that were not ONA, I've always felt welcomed and accepted. It's mostly because I pass in this body as not being queer, or didn't know I was at the time. But I think the joy for me is I mentioned at the beginning of this that I got asked to do this work by 2 different people. One of them was my ministry mentor, Reverend Dr. Keith Phillips, who was a member at my church, Frieden's UCC. And he came, when he first came there, he slipped in the back of the church after the prelude and sat in the back and left before the postlude. And he did that for a year to make sure that this church truly welcomed him. And the church wasn't O&A yet. And then slowly but surely people got to know him and he let them in. He took me under his wing as a retired minister. And you wouldn't think that a guy in his 18, 19, 20s and a guy in his 70s would have so much in common, but we did. And he invited me to help lead the O&A process at that church, which prepared me to lead the O&A conference or lead the conference become O&A. So my joy is his legacy. When we when it almost passed you almost unanimously, as Chad named, the tears that filled my eyes were not for myself. It was for Keith's legacy, who's now passed and was not there on that day because he passed away earlier than that. But to say this is what is cementing his legacy, that he lived 75 years for, you know, that is something that I will get to count as a blessing that not very many people get to do, which is to help live out someone they love's legacy. So that's kind of selfishly a little bit is for Keith, is for me.
Well, yeah, it's hard for me to sum that up, so I'm not going to try. But again, even just hearing, starting out with Izzy's testimony, I feel like that should be the billboard. This is why we want to do this. Oh my gosh, you know, so people will understand. We are about love, and we want everyone, everyone, um, to know that they are loved. Um, hmm. Yeah, I grew up in Milledgeville, Georgia. Uh, maybe in which is central Georgia, not close to Valdosta, but certainly some of the same kind of sentiments around me. But my church, I was fortunate, had the associate pastor who was my dad, and he would greet visitors every week and say, "Welcome to the church where everybody is somebody." And you know, I don't think there's um, any stronger statement um, that you can make about being welcome. And it certainly has guided me throughout my life. And again, led me to this task force because I do believe in the inherent dignity, worth, and lovability of every human being. God created us and said, "This is good. This is good." Um, Thank you so much, panel, for your reflections. We do have a little bit more time if we have some questions. Do we have questions in the chat, Kim?
Let's invite folks. We have about 5 minutes allotted.
Okay.
If anybody would like to has a question, please put it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. If not, we'll move forward. Are there any questions that folks would like to include in the chat? I don't see any coming up. Y'all have been thorough and amazing. So I think we can go to
It
closing
looked
thoughts from the panel. Oh,
it
wait,
looked like
wait.
there were two, or at
Oh,
least
there they
one.
come. There they come.
Yeah, I think at least someone put in there a question about trying to understand folks who are against the concept or against the movement and what the thought process is there. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts, but it's a range. It can include everything from folks who strongly that have a strong view that the Bible is the literal word of God, infallible, and therefore they have clear instructions that LGBTQ people are not living lives of righteousness, right? That can be a whole position of it. I often think that is the minority of folks who are against it live in that camp. I think a lot of people have identified themselves as I'm not against or against the rights of LGBTQ people. I just don't know that they need a special resolution, that they're not special. I think that is where a lot of people, especially people of straight privilege land, is I'm not against gay people. I think God does love them and I want them in my church and all the things. But if they carve out something for them and the African American folks have a resolution carved out for them and the the mental health folks have a thing carved out for them. What's left for me who's not Black, mentally ill, or an LGBTQ person? Like, if I don't identify in one of those special boxes they're making resolutions for, where's my voice as a straight, white, probably male person? That's usually the folks that represent the biggest block of being against O&A, is they're scared of losing some power and some privilege and some exclusivity.
And to that end, to some degree, it's also people might be on the camp of we don't want to get political. The church shouldn't be political, so let's not go there. That's all. It's attached to everything you just said, Dakota, but it sometimes gets couched in that kind of language too.
Thank you for that, Chad. That's part of what we heard, certainly when we were looking at becoming an open and affirming congregation. And we've even in the past, before I came to this church, um, had members of the LGBT community who said, please do not vote to become open and affirming because this is an at-will state. And if people find out that we attend this church and if they make the connection that we're queer and that we're part of this church that's welcoming to queers, we could lose our job, we could lose our housing, we could lose, right. And so there was some fear around just the label and being connected with the label. Um, and what's interesting, I mean, I've had people within the LGBT community leave the church, and they have said, "You're too political." And what I have attempted to explain to them is that Jesus was pretty radical and pretty political, and that we can't always separate the two. And as long as we're preaching the gospel and preaching what about Jesus's life, I don't feel bad about jumping into the political arena. And so, yeah, it's been kind of an interesting um, navigate that fear, the fear that people bring with them, because it comes from a lot of different places. And for someone like me who grew up in the South, like that fear is real.
Mm-hmm.
You know what it can cost you if you start plastering like rainbow flags and stuff all over your car. You're in for it, right? And I learned very early on, you don't put all those stickers on your car because you don't know what could happen. Hate
Yeah.
crime is a real thing. So it's, yeah, there are some real challenges. And Indiana, as much as we would like to believe that we're a part of the North, we're like the northern southern state
Mm-hmm.
because we're
Mm-hmm.
still pretty red. I mean, we bleed bad up here. And Elkhart, while we're close to South Bend, which is a much more progressive city, we're extremely conservative. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're like the one blue dot in a sea of red. And it's sometimes that's hard. And we don't know, again, because of political climate, whether to hang a rainbow flag on the flagpole or not, right? We've had those conversations since day one. And it's hard. Like that fear can be so real and coming at you from a variety of perspectives. But please, whatever you do, don't let that fear keep you from moving forward and
Yeah.
keep you from putting this to a vote because it really can save somebody's life.
It can. And Izzy, I mean, I think your point is well taken too, that like a lot of this work is not, I mean, the Clobber Pass study is amazing. You should definitely do that. It's a good queer 101. Here, what does the Bible say? Answer all the questions. But I think a lot of education, it happens from the pulpit of saying Jesus's life, message, death, and resurrection are inherently political statements. If you say you don't want politics in church, you don't want Jesus in church. Jesus was a political being. I think what they don't want is controversy. And politics and controversy are not the same thing. Politics is making sure the water that comes out of your faucet is clean. That shouldn't be controversial, right? We've made it that way. But if people say, I don't want controversy in the church, that's different than I don't want political in the church. So doing some work around studying Jesus talking more about money than he ever talked about sex, or doing studies about how Jesus was flipping over tables in the synagogue versus just sitting around the campfire singing kumbaya, right? Like that's different. The other thing I think I would name is that the do not be afraid piece is important because that language recurs in the Bible more than any other phrase in the Bible
Mhm.
is do not be
Mhm.
afraid. And so it's easy to say it when you're in a place of privilege or when you're in a place of safety. Like Izzy named, that's not true for everybody. So it's identifying, okay, that person over there cannot be brave enough to be either out or public or whatever, but this ally over here can. Identifying who your allies are critically important in that work. Um, and then just the final thing for this thing I will say is the evolution of this movement has led to in our congregation that's been O&A since 2005 or earlier, I think, is we don't want to be labeled the gay church. And believe it or not, it's not straight people saying that. It is the lesbians in our congregation who are like, I don't want to be the gay church. And I'm like, well, I guess I have to listen to you because you're gay. Like you're the poster child for LGBTQ and you don't want to be labeled as that, so we won't do that. Because they name that like the Metropolitan Community Church, the MCC, was formed as a gay church by and for gay people, not straight people. That is not what people want when they come to a UCC O&A church. They don't want to be a gay church. They just want to be an LGBTQ Christian worshiping in a welcoming space. And so a lot of the folks in my congregation say, I'm just like the straight people. I just happen to love someone that's the same gender as me, right? Like that. And I just want to be the normal person I am, like everybody else, in a welcoming space. And so it there is such diversity in even the queer community that has to be understood as you do some of this work. And it's difficult for straight people to get their heads around sometimes, but don't worry, we'll be patient. We'll be catty, but we'll be patient.
Yeah, Dakota, I love the whole argument that, we're just like straights and straights are just like us. And then you see a, 6'5" drag queen and butterfly wings and 5-inch stiletto heels walking across the stage, right? Yeah, we're
Right.
just like everybody else. Like,
We
yeah,
are.
and it does feel, I mean, I'm just going to name this. It feels like the 80s were a lot easier time for us to be queer than it is even today.
Oh
Right.
my
And
gosh.
there were
I was
bars
so
everywhere and there were spaces that were just ours and we could claim them and own them and be a part of them. And now like a lot of that has gone away. It's like the more we fought for our rights, the more we've lost some of our identity. And
absolutely. I always say
yeah,
that I grew up in the wrong time period. I should have been I
yeah,
should have been a gay guy in the 80s. I
yeah. You
probably
missed a
would have.
good time, man.
I
It
bet it
was
was
fun.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, but I think the church can make space for that
Yeah.
and can help bring that back. I'm actually going to be preaching on ONA Sunday in a church in Kentucky, and I was talking to the pastor on the phone, and she said, "Oh, and we're having a fundraiser the night before. We've got a drag queen that's going to MC." And I'm like, "Yes, thank you! Like, bring it into this space. We need that. We need that colorful engagement. Like, people need to see the spectrum of who we are, even in the
Absolutely.
church."
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming this morning and participating in this process. And we especially like to thank our Indiana, Kentucky conference siblings for their participation. You really have shared some jewels of wisdom, and I know we will be better for it. As we prepare to close, I want to leave us with this. Whatever the outcome, the deeper question is, who are we becoming together? And even more importantly, is what we are becoming life-giving for all of God's people? Let us pray. Holy One, still speaking God, we thank you for this time of listening, for honest voices, and for the courage to discern together. In this season of resurrection, speak again your word to us. Do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Let not your hearts be troubled. Remind us that discernment is holy work, a process of praying, testing, and trusting you. When the path feels uncertain, steady us. When the conversation is hard, soften us. When we are weary, renew us. Form us as a covenant people, bound not by sameness, but by love, committed to justice and joy, inclusion and belonging. Guide the Southeast Conference in the days ahead. Give us wisdom that listens, faith that stretches, and love that holds us together. For you are still shaping your church, still reforming, still calling us forward. Lead us not just to decisions, but to deeper faithfulness. Amen.
Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you being here today, and thanks to our panel.